This video is part 3 of Chapter 8, Personality Theories for PSY 110S, the Psychological Sciences. In this part of the chapter, we're going to be learning about humanistic theories. And if you take a kind of a historical view, you had psychoanalytic theories that occupied a lot of time and really were foundational to the shaping of the helping profession side of psychiatry specifically, but then later also psychology. It kind of set down the basic model for providing psychotherapy to people who had psychological issues that weren't organic in nature. It wasn't until, there had always been critics of the psychoanalytic approach, lots of critics. But during the later 50s into the 1960s, there was a broad, in the Western world, humanistic movement of really trying to take some of the dark negativity that was, coming out of especially the Freudian model, which tended to look at people as basically evil, and they had to be tamed and controlled in order to live with other people. It's a pretty dark view of human nature. At the same time, behavioral psychology had emerged through the latter part of the 40s, 50s, really hit its stride in the 50s and 60s. Also a kind of pessimistic model, because basically people like B.F. Skinner argued human beings are the sum total of their learning experiences. They don't have free will. And discussing things like emotion, that's just nonsense. You can't measure it, so you have no business studying it. So also kind of a pessimistic model. So the general broad humanistic movement wanted to re-center emotional experience and really kind of send us in a somewhat different direction, a more positive, growth-oriented direction. That was consistent with things going on in Western culture during that time period. As I just said, the humanistic movement was really a response to what are called deterministic models. The psychoanalytic model is deterministic in that you are born with a set of instinctive drives, and that biology is going to dictate everything that comes after. The behavioral model is deterministic in that you are basically the sum total of everything you've learned. There is no you that is independent of your learning experience. Those were the dominant models of psychology at the time. But not everyone was comfortable with those models. And in fact, many people were frustrated, irritated, by the fact that they just didn't really honor the way people felt about themselves and the way they felt about other people. So the humanistic approach, and this is especially true in the Western world, the humanistic approach emphasizes the ability of human beings to make choices and to act on those choices when they want. There's also a really strong emphasis on every person being uniquely themselves and capable of growth and resiliency and becoming more than the sum total of their parts. So the approach really emphasizes positive emotions, positive motivations, and focuses very specifically on growth. So what is that thing that all humans are born with? The capacity to grow and change. Maslow was primarily a researcher, not a psychotherapist. While there are some applications of his approach in a psychotherapeutic context, that was not what he was interested in. His primary theory, there's like two branches of it. On the one hand, he was very interested in doing qualitative research describing highly developed, very healthy, creative people to describe what they're like, kind of looking at them as a goal. So he sought out individuals, both historical figures and also contemporaries, who he saw as particularly healthy, particularly creative, extraordinary people. And he kind of used that as the model, the template for what a well-lived human life should look like. He tried to emphasize the goal of actualizing your full potential. He believed that all human beings were born with a set of inborn potentials that they could manifest. If they had the right circumstances, the right situations, they would be able to get there to that fully developed person that they're supposed to be. One part of the theory, in addition to describing these very healthy, creative people, he also proposed a motivational model. Now, for a lot of psychology students, they learn about Maslow not as a personality theorist, but as a motivation theorist. He's both. He proposed what's called the hierarchy of needs to describe how we have to take into consideration we have certain kinds of needs that are associated with survival, both biological survival and psychological survival, and then we have the bigger stuff. We have the stuff where we can manifest our full potential. And he described those as, actualization needs. So he looked at these different kinds of needs. Some needs are basic survival needs. Other needs are more actualization-based, manifesting that full potential. And that became his theory of motivation. Now, you may have some familiarity with Maslow's hierarchy. It tends to be in pictures. It tends to be represented as a kind of pyramid shape, where on the bottom you have basic biological needs in the first two levels. So you have basic psychological needs, things like hunger and thirst. You have basic safety needs, having housing, having a stable environment that's not a threat. So those are basic biological needs. And when you are in a need state, you're going to be uncomfortable. You're going to be in pain from hunger and thirst. You're going to be overwhelmed by threat and anxiety when your safety needs aren't being met. So when your physiological and safety needs aren't being met, you feel negative experiences like pain, anxiety, fear, and so on. Now, up one level from that are psychological needs in two forms. You have belongingness and love needs, and then one level above that are esteem needs. Belongingness and love is about feeling like other people care for you. We need to be loved. We need to be accepted. We need to have a sense that we're connected to others and that they love us. After that is satisfied, we like to feel like we're good, like we have a positive self-esteem, we're competent, we're independent. Those two, the belongingness and love needs and the esteem needs, they're still needs that when they're not being met cause pain. And we will then be motivated to do things to reduce that pain. So at the level of physiological needs, if you're hungry, you feel hunger pains, you eat food in order to reduce the pain. If you're feeling unsafe, you will go to a safe place in order to reduce the fear that's causing that sense of insecurity. So you're going to engage in behavior that reduces the need. And then, if you're not feeling loved right now and you're lonely, you're going to seek out people. You're going to seek out connection. If you're not feeling like you have positive self-esteem and achievement and confidence, you're going to be motivated to engage in things that will make you feel better about yourself. So everything in the first four levels is basically what Maslow called a deficiency need. So it becomes motivating when you're in a deficiency state. The opposite is true of self-actualization needs. Self-actualization needs are primarily motivated by this inborn need for creativity, inborn need for mastery, inborn need to experience things at a much more deep level. So self-actualization needs are growth related, whereas the other four needs are deficiency related. When we seek self-actualization, we often intentionally put ourselves in a situation where we are uncomfortable. So you're trying new things, you're stretching, you're pushing. You may, in fact, put yourself in a state of fear or threat or pain in order to grow. So you have deficiency needs in the first four levels, what Maslow called being needs or B needs at the top. Self-actualization needs are associated with becoming who you're fully capable of becoming. The other needs, just basic survival. You just want to avoid discomfort at those levels. In self-actualization needs, you may actually have to put yourself out there, suffer in order to grow to your fullest extent. Now, I mentioned before that Maslow was interested in describing highly accomplished, incredibly creative, what he called self-actualized people. He described the characteristics of self-actualized people, and where the data came from. He analyzed historical figures, but also peers of his, people that he thought, just in his own personal opinion, were highly accomplished. So he looked at historical figures through their writings, through biographies and so on, but he also looked at contemporaries, people who were alive at the same time as him. And he then, through his investigation, generated a list of characteristics that he thought shaped these people. Now, recognize that the people he was describing were mostly white, mostly well-off, mostly men, almost all men, and they tended to be from Western cultures, were highly educated, and highly competent. That's a slice of humanity. It's certainly not characteristic of all human beings. So, what traits did he come up with? He felt that these were individuals who tended to accept themselves as they were. They tended to be accepting and tolerant of others, and they tended to have an understanding of the nature of the world. They did have a tendency to need their privacy. They had relatively close, small number of friends, and their relationships tended to have a deeply emotional quality to them. They tended to be very independent, creative, capable of being a self-starter. He also described them as having democratic values. Again, Maslow was American. He had a very decided attitude towards democracy being superior to other ways of thinking. So that's a criticism that you could level against the entire model. He also said that these were individuals who often reported in their memoirs and their letters having had what Maslow called peak experiences. So these were moments of time where people experienced a deeply transformative insight experience. For some of these people, these were religious experiences. For others, they were just, really intense moments of beauty and recognition. And these were typically described by the individuals he studied as being moments where they moved from one point in their lives into a transition into something more, where they were functioning more fully. Maslow's hierarchy has been criticized in much the same way that many of the early personality theories have been criticized, because it's hard to empirically validate. The hierarchy itself includes some vague concepts that aren't operationally defined. Also, his model where he talked about self-actualized people, it's very subjectively defined, and he selected, not randomly, he selected individuals that he was going to characterize as self-actualized, and that raises a lot of questions about reliability and validity. Now, that said, there has been research more recently on self-actualization. Your authors mention Kaufman's work using the characteristics of self-actualization scale, and there is, based on research like this, some evidence that self-actualization is something humans do, and that it is connected with senses of self-satisfaction and self-esteem and so on. So there is some evidence to support some of Maslow's ideas, evidence against it in some other respects, and then just whole chunks of the theory that can't be validated one way or the other. Well, Carl Rogers, who by all accounts was a lovely human being, his theory, unlike Maslow, who was basically a researcher, Rogers was a clinician. Career-wise, he didn't start out that way. He was originally studying theology and then moved on to studying clinical work. He eventually developed what is sometimes called self-theory of personality. His theory is often placed in opposition to both behaviorism and psychodynamic or psychoanalytic thinking. He had a long-running battle with B.F. Skinner, where this is before the internet. If it was today, they would have had a Twitter throwdown. But at the time, it was through journal articles. So, Rogers would put something out, and then Skinner would go after it, and then Rogers would go after him, and Skinner would put something out, and Rogers would go after it, and they would just, go back and forth, back and forth. So his theory, historically, is kind of positioned as the opposition to psychodynamic and behavioral theory. And that's mostly on the philosophical side of the theory. On the practical side, Rogers felt that as a clinician, psychoanalysis just wasn't doing much good. He started to develop, in his work with his own clients, in his work with students that he was training, he started to develop an approach to psychotherapy that was very different from classical psychoanalysis. In classical psychoanalysis, people defer to the psychiatrist, to the therapist, and say, "Therapist, you know best. I don't know what's going on in my own psyche. You tell me the interpretation and tell me what my problems are." Rogers was like, "No. You, client, not patient, client, are the best expert on what's going on in your mind. You tell me what you're feeling, what you're experiencing, and we'll work on where you're at to move you in a direction where you can experience greater growth and happiness." So this became client-centered or person-centered psychotherapy. And if you go to therapy today, most of the basic structure and setup of the psychotherapy situation is based on this person-centered model that Rogers used. He emphasized that when people come to therapy, they need to have a safe place. They have to have a space where they can feel comfortable being open, and that would lead to that person being situated such that they can grow and self-actualize and hopefully reach their full potential. He felt that all people have a strong need for what he called positive regard. They have a need to be accepted by others, to have the affection and love of others, especially the significant people in their lives. So early in our lives, that's parents, caregivers, siblings, close friends, and so on. We need to have that positive regard. And we also need to have parents who allow us to explore who we are and who we can become. So parents or caregivers, they can, if under non-ideal situations, they can set up what are called conditions of worth. So basically communicating to the child that I will love you if. I'll love you if you do this. I will not love you if you do that. I will only love you under these conditions. And what will happen then is you will develop a sense of self that is unhealthy because it's based on these conditions of worth. What people need is unconditional positive regard, where the child learns that they will be loved even when they make mistakes. They will be taught how to not make those mistakes, but they'll be loved at the end of the day. So infants and children are seen as developing self-concept in connection to these conditions of worth, and that can lead to problems that people will feel insecure, they will feel anxious, they will feel unworthy, unable to live up to the standards that their caregivers have for them. What we need, he argued, ideally, is unconditional positive regard. And here, we want to be regarded positively by other people. For a lot of us, we learned that we get that positive regard by meeting the conditions that they set up for us. If we're trying to meet these conditions of worth, but it feels unnatural to us, that creates conflict. So the psychological conflict in Rogers' model is this idea of conditional positive regard. Instead of that, what you need is acceptance and approval without conditions of worth being set up for you. Now, this part of Rogers' model, very similar to Karen Horney's model. She argued that, especially connected to gender, like little girls were often, had these imposing conditions of worth saying you need to be sweet, you need to be kind, you need to be attractive to particularly males, you have to be empathetic and caring and nurturant, all of these things. If you do these things, you will be valuable and you will be loved. If you are a male, the conditions of worth are you need to be strong, tough, dominant, in control, powerful. If you do those things, you will be loved, you will be valuable. Rogers didn't hone in 100% on the gender thing like Karen Horney did, but he agreed. If we set up standards for our children that are highly restrictive, we are interfering with their ability to discover the natural unfolding of their unique personality. He believed that we're all born with an imprint in our DNA of who we're supposed to be, and our job as good human beings is to let it unfold. Parents, caregivers, their job is to show that child they will be loved no matter how that life unfolds. Now, that doesn't mean you're being completely permissive. That's not the goal. The goal is the child needs to understand you will be loved and cared for without condition. If you do things that are wrong, like you beat up your sibling, you're going to have consequences for that, because there are ways in which that is simply wrong. And we need to find a more positive way for you to deal with your frustrations. So morality is communicated, but the love for the child is never in question. So self-theory is basically, if you have conditions of worth, if you're a child who has been told, I will love you only if, that leads to what's called conditional positive regard, where the child over time says, I'm only a good person if I live up to these standards. That leads to a divergence from the self that you are supposed to be. So your self-concept ends up not being congruent or connected to or overlapping with the true self. And that means that self-actualization is going to be interfered with. You're not going to self-actualize, and you'll likely not feel good. So therapy is designed to restore unconditional positive regard. Replace that conditional positive regard with unconditional positive regard. That allows for the top level on that chart for the self-concept to move into greater congruency with the true self, and then the person will become capable of self-actualization. And that concludes part 3.